testimony underscores the Justice Department's ongoing effort to differentiate between increasing violence in some cities and Floyd's death, which has led to state charges against 4 officers and is under investigation by federal authorities. Massive but peaceful demonstrations followed Floyd's death in May. The Attorney General, speaking as Congress and the public pay respect to the late Rep. John Lewis, acknowledged to lawmakers that Floyd's death struck a chord in the black community because it reinforced concerns black people are treated differently by police. But he condemned Americans who he says have responded inappropriately to Floyd's death through what he said was rioting and anarchy. But what about the alt-left that went charging at the alt-right? Basically is what he's saying. As elected officials of the federal government, every member of this committee, regardless of your political views or your feelings about the Trump administration, should condemn violence against federal officers and destruction of federal property. Wrong. So should state and local leaders who have a responsibility to keep their communities safe. To tacitly condone destruction and anarchy is to abandon the basic rule of law principles that should unite us even in a politically divisive time. Civil unrest escalated in Portland after federal agents were accused of whisking people away in unmarked cars without probable cause. The people were detained and later released. Jesus Christ. Weren't these guys the ones who were against catch and release? I shouldn't egg them on. I shouldn't egg them on to be even more, draconian. And in Washington, D.C., peaceful protesters were violently cleared from the streets by federal officers using smoke bombs and pepper balls before a photo op by Trump in front of a church where Barr had accompanied him. Barr has defended as necessary the broad use of law enforcement power to deal with the situation, but the department's internal watchdog has opened investigations into use of force and other tactics by agents in those cities. Beyond the federal response to the demonstrations, Barr was expected to be pressed in detail about his intervention in criminal cases arising from special counsel Robert Mueller's Russia investigation. The hearing will provide Barr with a forum to offer his most detailed account to date for his actions in the criminal cases, which he has said were taken in the interests of justice and without political pressure. Those include the Justice Department's decision to drop the prosecution of former administration National Security Advisor Michael Flynn, a request now tied up in court. Barr pushed for a more lenient sentence for another Trump ally, Roger Stone, prompting the entire trial team's departure. This is from AP, by the way. It's the top story, so if you want to look it up and read along, I'm nearly at the end, sorry. That decision was at the center of a hearing before the committee last month, when one of the prosecutors alleged politics from Justice Department leadership had influenced handling of the sentence. Barr has said that Flynn, who pleaded guilty as part of Mueller's probe to lying to the FBI, should never have been charged, and that the original sentencing recommendation for Stone, also charged in the Mueller investigation, was excessive. Republican lawmakers have been overwhelmingly supportive of Barr's performance, bootleggers. Even among the GOP committee members, though, Barr faces pressure to deliver results soon on an investigation that he initiated into the origins of the Russia probe. It is unclear when or how that investigation being led by U.S. Attorney John Durham of Connecticut will end. Barr said he hopes to have results by the end of the summer. Cool. So from what I understand about Barr, so he worked for George Herbert Walker Bush, Bush 41, and so Barr worked for H.W. Bush, and one of the through lines of his career is the expansion of executive power. He appears to be, at least until recently, he appears to be largely a conservative authoritarian. Kind of the run-of-the-mill conservative over his career, but particularly his purview was, as a lawyer, finding every avenue he could to expand the powers of the president and of the executive branch. Now, what people disagree on is the extent of what you would, I guess, refer to as the extent to which he's truly like a neo-fascist. Sorry. The extent to which he's a neo-fascist, right? I can't. I'm in the wrong character. Yeah, when I say neo-fascist, what I'm referring to
I'm stopping the
is
car in the median here. Head to your shooter's nest and call Mike.
All right, man, whatever.
neo-fascism is basically kind of the craft of trying to create the vessels and vehicles for establishing a fascistic style state in a world that's supposed to be, liberalized beyond it. There's a cop here. Do I want to steal this? Nah, we'll just go over to this end. So someone you would refer to as a neo-fascist would be probably the prime example of a neo-fascist is Narendra Modi, who is the current prime minister of India. But throughout his career, Modi's entire career experiment has been pushing the boundaries of what has always been the legacy of the RSS. So Modi's a part of an organization called I don't know how much it needs to be said now, but actually I'm probably gonna give the non-benefit of the doubt and presume that most people still don't know about Indian politics. Modi is the current prime minister of India, and his party is called the Bharatiya Janata Party. And the Bharatiya Janata Party or BJP is their short form. They're the political wing of what is called the RSS, which stands for Rashtriya Swayamsevak Sangh. And the RSS, also known as the Sangh Parivar, which just means the community family, is the Hindu nationalist community, the national Hindu nationalist community of India. So after World War II, the world kind of rapidly started to liberalize.
Fuck those dudes.
And nativist authoritarian experiments around the world really started to lose their ground. Because generally speaking, the adoption of liberal values, of pluralism, the globalization of the world, increases in things like miscegenation and exposure to other cultures, globalization, all of these things make it really difficult to stoke fear of the other in the way that you could. In the way that they could, not just in Nazi Germany, but like during the turn of the 20th century when...
Hey y'all, we got ourselves some boiler suits.
The expansion of military power was not being accompanied by a real concerted increase in globalism, right? Like there was a bit of it was kind of sticky. It took a little while for global industrialization to catch up with that kind of domestic industrialization of economies. So throughout the 20th century, like fascistic experiments started to die off, mostly because people are being exposed to other cultures, and it's hard to traffic in fear of an other that people now kind of understand. Also, what really hurt the RSS was obviously that a member of theirs shot and killed the father of the country. One of the worst things for RSS power was the assassination of Mahatma Gandhi. So throughout the course of the 20th century, India started to form international relationships, and like every other country,
man, don't worry about them.
And through that, the Congress Party started to gain power, and the Congress Party was always the liberal secular party, the pluralist party, and through the expansion of their power, it just became harder and harder to be a fascist.
Man, you got off lucky, homie.
What Modi's BJP was, so the BJP took power once or twice through a coalition government in the late 20th century. But when Modi became an actor, what Modi did was a reskin of the RSS, which was the Hindu Nationalist Organization of India. Where am I going? So Modi's political experiment is the liberalization of fascism, essentially. I would argue he's been the most successful at accomplishing this. There are other neo-fascists who have had success, but largely through circumstance. Modi specifically was through an extremely astute and effective theory in which you use the vessels of liberalism to concentrate power and wealth and capital, and then you use wealth and capital to take the economically marginalized and the racially marginalized and, associate them as one. Like, this is the experiment with capitalistic fascism in the United States as well, obviously. But with Modi, there was an intent to it. There was a very, very, very specific. And also the using that to hide your power level. He's the highest profile crypto-fascist, I think. Definitely the most successful high-profile crypto-fascist, possibly in contemporary global history. And what he did as Chief Minister of Gujarat was, Gujarat is a northwestern state in India. And in 2002, there was a train. Actually, you know what? I'm gonna look this up right now because I really don't want to misstate what the origin of the riots were. Usually, 2002 Gujarat Pogrom. There was a pogrom in Gujarat, and as far as I understand, I want to make sure that this was. Okay, yeah. So, there's a lot of background to it. The burning of the demolition of Babri Masjid, the attempt to build a temple at Ayodhya. Ayodhya is considered to be the place where Prince Rama ruled, and he was one of the incarnations of Vishnu. So there's a lot of a lot of Hindu angst around Ayodhya. And as I was saying, in Gujarat in 2002, there were pilgrims returning from Ayodhya, and there's a lot of anger and anguish around that because Ayodhya was the site of a mosque that a bunch of Hindu zealots kind of burnt down because they think Ayodhya belongs to them. And some pilgrims were returning from Ayodhya, and the train was set on fire, and the Hindu pilgrims all were burned alive. And what happened was pretty predictable, especially in India. There was... So obviously, Hindus were really angry about the burning of their pilgrims. And typically what happens in,
Man, look the fuck out.
What happens here in America is when there is some kind of racial violence or nativist or tribal violence against your people, you'll start protesting, you'll start demonstrating, community figures will start organizing, and they'll start making speeches, going on television. In India, especially the north of India, what people often do is they get sickles and machetes and they start hacking people from the group that they think is to blame. And that's what happened for about 3 days. There was a pogrom enacted against Muslims in Gujarat. for about 3 days. And as the violence started, Narendra Modi said to his police force, kind of the opposite of what's going on now, where kind of the opposite of what's happening for what's happening right now with the BLM protests is, there's a minority, a very, very slim minority of protests, like the article that I read just earlier, where Barr is trying to paint the rioters as like this completely independent and co-equal entity to the protesters, and trying to paint the violence as like this redoubtable force that is comparable to the protests, to the peaceful protests. And that's kind of the right-wing agenda today, is to make the violence seem like the main event, so to speak, and the peaceful protests almost as a side note. With the riots in Gujarat, it was exactly the opposite. And they did the same thing with the pogrom in Delhi a couple months ago, which was to create the appearance that these weren't riots, that these were not systematic hackings of innocent Muslim people, but rather just peaceful protesters exercising their right to free speech in a democracy, which, if anything, the numbers after the fact showed that was not true.
There's your share, bro. Think of me. Packy McCreary of Duke's LC.
I remember Packy McCreary. That was an unfortunate sentence to say during a conversation about rampant Islamophobia, but so it's day one. God knows how many people are dead. There are too many people dead to get an accurate count, and the approach of the BJP and of the RSS government in Gujarat is to say, since there are too many people dead to accurately count, now the RSS will say, hey, we don't know how many people are dead, so we don't know the extent of the violence, but what we do know is that there's peaceful protesting going on. And so Modi used that uncertainty as cover to say, I don't want to get in the way of their democratic demonstration, so he orders the police not to intervene. A very specific and clear and deliberate, right? The facts on the ground is that there are people dying. The facts on the ground is that there is an immense amount of violence happening and innocent people are being slaughtered. And what Modi decides to do is weave weave his way into PR deniability, and he says, do not interfere. There are X number of Hindus demonstrating, and we don't know the extent of the violence. We'd rather not get in the way of the protests. Absolute BS. And investigations and commissions after the fact basically said that there was not enough evidence. Think of Robert Mueller saying there is not sufficient evidence for me to recommend indictments against Donald Trump for colluding with Russia. He didn't say that Trump didn't collude. He said, I was not able to find evidence that he colluded. I was not able to find definitive evidence that he colluded on which I can responsibly recommend an indictment against the sitting president. That's what the commission basically said about Modi, was we cannot find evidence that Modi intended to stoke the violence, and therefore we cannot recommend indictments against him. It was not a declaration of innocence. And so every Hindu nationalist and every supporter of the BJP was like, it's what's called a clean chit.
Man, sorry about that.
Clean chit is basically a clean white piece of paper. It's the legal equivalent of a clean bill of health that clears you of wrongdoing. But that wasn't the case, right? He did not have a clean chit. It was just the the absence of convicting evidence in an investigation that was not, you know, that was not an official trial, right? It was a preliminary investigation into wrongdoing in Gujarat. But there was, at best, without any shred of reasonable doubt, there was at best systematic negligence. And this is exactly the system he gained, right? Modi did not pay a political price for this, and it showed when in 2014 he was elected prime minister as the leader of the BJP. And the BJP gained their first absolute majority in, I think, in India, since Indian independence, or maybe since 1971. I'm not sure. I can't remember if they ever had an absolute majority before that. Maybe once in the 70s or the 60s, sometime around the peak of Indira Gandhi's unpopularity, maybe right after she left office, after the emergency.
Ready to go.
And this was all the experiment, right? The point is, fascism in the 30s and 40s involved direct action on the part of fascistic right-wing revolutionaries against the people they were basically I need a getaway vehicle. Yes. So, yeah, old school fascism was about stoking, hatred and distrust of the groups that you wanted to oppress. You absolute jerk. But just as importantly, involved violence against the systems of liberalism that you wanted to undermine and destroy. And that was very, very important. Because back then you could get away with it. You can't get away with that anymore. Like, probably the best example of this is Kristallnacht, right? The Night of Broken Glass, in which they had overwhelming popular support at that point. Them calling for direct action against communists and against Jewish industrialists and merchants was completely socially acceptable. That's not something that would fly today. So what the BJP's experiment was in, as this neo-fascist entity, was to see if they could stoke the violence without directly calling for it. Very much a crypto-fascist experiment. Where you at, Mr. Right? Revolutionary? So neo-fascism is about, the liberalization of fascism, about trying to create tribalist and authoritarian institutions within the confines of liberalism, which means that you have to avoid direct incitement. You have to avoid using the state as a weapon until you are situated to do so, and you have to expand the parameters of the executive branch, and you have to expand the parameters of the federal government slowly, and of the military slowly, until you reach the point where there is no ability to resist. Is this an acceptable getaway? I don't think this is, but... And culturally speaking, the Indian fascism has always been better situated because of the century-long epidemic of religious violence in India that dates, back to and beyond partition, because it's rooted in a lot of things. It's rooted in a casteism that is endemic to the South Asian subcontinent. It is rooted in so much. Okay, so this is not an acceptable getaway vehicle. Yeah. All of that's basically just an example of what it's the most obvious example of what neo-fascism is. Another example would be Benjamin Netanyahu, who basically tries to use it's difficult for white fascists to succeed. It's very difficult for white fascists to find success because they have to create an entire mythology of demographic displacement and white genocide in order to get their theories and philosophies to catch on. So they have to lock onto an angst. They have to lock onto an angst. They have to create an origin myth for that angst and market it to a specific audience and get it to catch on. With Netanyahu, the job was a lot easier, and not just Netanyahu, but Likud generally as a party. But Netanyahu is kind of the apex of this. With Netanyahu, it was a lot easier because there is, obviously legitimate, constant concerns of, there's a legitimate fear of genocide that constantly follows Jewish people around the world and Jewish diaspora, which allows him to create the systems of fear that stoke international support for Likud. And then also specifically Israel, which is situated on a continent surrounded by people probably less, definitely less powerful than them, but also with all of the markers and aesthetics of hatred that make it easy to make Israelis feel afraid. So Netanyahu is kind of, certainly less effective than Modi, but also by virtue of his, of the kind of the situation that he was empowered into, is a lot better at setting up, an apartheid state against Arab Israelis and Palestinians. But Modi's definitely the prime example of a successful neo-fascist, and the BJP generally, heavily under his leadership. To the point where, you literally have people at his very right hand, no pun intended, who oftentimes directly undermine his crypto-fascist experiment. Like Amit Shah, I'm not sure how intentful it is, but it seems like Amit Shah is generally negative for the kind of undertoned experiment that Modi goes for, but who knows? This location is too steep. So the question about Bill Barr is is the guy a neo-fascist, or is he just is he just kind of a demagogue, intent on expanding a more generalized right-wing authoritarianism? The question is largely irrelevant in Trumpian America, but the guy clearly has a disdain for liberal institutions, and obviously has no problem trafficking in fascist talking points and trafficking in crypto-fascism. And I think he either is deluded enough to think that he can still achieve that sort of conservative Big Brother state that he has always been aiming to build. Or the guy has just straight up said, like, the only way to preserve my political to preserve what's left of my political vision for this country is to why isn't this a discrete location? Come on. The only way to preserve my political legacy and vision is just to commit to what, in my opinion, is the inevitable outcome of conservatism and of, of social and fiscal conservatism, I guess. So even if he's not a neo-fascist...
Hey, I got a ride for our getaway, homie.
Well done. Where's it stored?
Mirror Park.
Okay, that's everything. Come back to the lot and I'll talk you through the plan. When we get the stuff, Steve says we gotta take it to Devin Weston, the guy we met at that interrogation. It's a big investor or something. Anyway, that don't matter. I'll handle the drop-off.
The best and least, so like the least complimentary but the most reassuring thing you can say about Barr is that he may not necessarily be a full-on fascist, but ultimately doesn't matter. He is the most effective right-wing authoritarian figure in the West, more so than Boris Johnson, far more so than Steve Bannon. And effectiveness-wise, more so than Jair Bolsonaro, right? Bolsonaro's not effective, he's just kind of geographically lucky. Not geographically lucky, we're geographically unlucky that he does so much damage, right? It doesn't do him any benefit, really. But, he's so harmful to the global ecosystem just by virtue of being president of Brazil rather than any country that's not situated on the Amazon. But Bill Barr is extremely intelligent, right? This is a Modi-grade authoritarian whose entire career has been an experiment on undermining democracy. So at the end of the day, it doesn't really matter whether or not the guy's a fascist. He operates at the behest of neo-fascism, and
Hey, what's cracking? What tea at?
Right there.
and fascism is
So we
the
really finna do
inevitable
this shit?
end goal of what
We
his
finna risk
experiment
our
is,
lives
whether
to rob
he
some
believes it or
motherfucking
not.
government killers again?
Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed the video, please be sure to like and subscribe for more political content. And new videos every day. And if you'd like to come participate in the discussion, I stream to Twitch live 1 to 3 p.m. Eastern Time on weekdays. So feel free to pop through Twitch or just stay tuned for another video tomorrow. Thanks for tuning in. Have a great day.